During the Age of Discovery, England had a unique Tudor dynasty. You will see the collision between feudal monarchy and the old era. Seeing the initial appearance of an empire that never sets. Seeing trade, swords, and artillery. Follow the sailing battleships like clouds across the seas, heading towards the utopia of the fantasy kingdom. Keywords of the novel. Live in 16th century England without pop-ups, live in 16th century England. Download the complete collection of TXT, live in the latest chapters of 16th century England. Chapter 1. The System of First Son Inheritance. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 1. The System of First Son Inheritance. The first wife of Henry VIII of the Tudor dynasty was his sister. In law. Because his father thinks Spain is very important, this Spanish princess cannot be wasted. So Henry married the widow. And become the first heir. Unfortunately, she didn't give birth to a son and was later laid off. The second wife is the maid of his first wife. He also did not give birth to a son, and it is said that he was arrogant and intervened in the court. Finally, he was beheaded by the executioner. The third wife is his second wife's maid. Gentle temperament and gentle treatment towards others. The most important thing is that she also gave birth to a son. Unfortunately, he died from puerperal fever. It is said that Henry VIII shed tears for it. The portrait of the fourth wife deceived the king. The portrait is as beautiful as a fairy, with a horse face when meeting. Henry VIII often worked overtime and overtime. However, this wife was well aware of current affairs, so she became the only wife of Henry VIII who died peacefully. The fifth wife was young and beautiful, and Henry VIII couldn't put it down. But the young queen insisted on wearing a green hat for the 48-year-old king, and in the end, her head was chopped off. The sixth wife is said to be very virtuous. Half a year after Henry VIII's death, he remarried her former lover. As a result, this lover actually seduced her stepdaughter, and the former queen eventually died of puerperal fever. However, at this time, Henry VIII had just ascended to the throne. When Matthew heard this news, it was already autumn 1509. So he couldn't help but think of these idle anecdotes. The old man of his lifetime knocked on the table and said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm asking you a question." "Matthew. Getting married. It's too early, right? I got married when I was only 19 years old." The middle-aged man lifted his eyelids and glanced at him. "If you don't get married, you won't have inheritance rights. You need to think carefully. Although your younger brother is incompetent, he is very likable to women." "Matthew. Then give it to him. You know, I don't want to deal with land for a lifetime." The middle-aged man's face twitched and he probably had the urge to beat up his disobedient son. Matthew said nonchalantly, "Isn't that great? When Danny gets married, he will soon have a grandson for you. And I happen to be able to travel, like London." The middle-aged man felt a bit dejected. Even the strongest person couldn't resist the passage of time. But he's too young to know how to manage. "Matthew, my family business can't be defeated by him. What's good about London? What are you doing there? I don't believe you're going to travel." "Matthew. Then give it to my sister, she can definitely inherit it." Father was angry and said, "Do you want her to never get married?" Matthew thought for a moment and said, "Remember, she never thought about getting married, so why not respect her wishes?" Father jumped up and waved his arm, roaring, "In this house, everyone must listen to me. It's all for your good. She will regret it in the future, and you too. Get out of here." Matthew immediately left the room and closed the door. Before closing the door, he asked, "Why did you suddenly mention the issue of inheritance? You're just over 45, right?" Seemingly questioning, actually caring. My father suddenly felt like a deflated ball. "I'm old, my legs and feet are no longer working, and I can't even climb the stairs. Matthew thought for a moment and said, "You have a bad habit, I've been wanting to say it for a long time. Don't keep your thighs crossed." Father's face began to twitch again, probably wanting to get angry again. This habit can lead to poor blood flow in the legs, and over time, it can cause inconvenience in the legs and feet. Father hesitated for a moment and said, "Really? But how was I doing well before?" Matthew smiled and said, "Before, you used to work in the fields, but in recent years, you've been sitting almost all day." The father was skeptical, but he trusted his son very much and said, "Is that so? Is this illness temporary?" "Of course, as long as you break this habit and take 2 steps when you have nothing to do, this habit will disappear within a few months at most." The mother's voice downstairs came. "Andrew, it's time for lunch." "Matthew, I know you're upstairs." The father and son spoke in unison, "Come on." Andrew approached Matthew and said, "My son, do you really not want inheritance?" Matthew thought for a moment and said, "Why insist on following the eldest son inheritance system? This system is like the second son committing some heinous crime against his parents. I think it's unreasonable." "Father. Do you really think so? Your younger brother must be very happy to hear what you said." Matthew smiled and said, "Can you bear to let him wander outside alone?" Andrew didn't answer and instead asked, "What do you think we should do? Let's talk about it when you really can't handle it." Andrew took a deep breath and said, "I must first establish an heir, understand?" Matthew could only say, "Give Danny the land and winery, and prepare a generous dowry for my sister, whether she wants to get married or not. I only want a blacksmith's shop." Andrew was somewhat surprised. How many people fought their heads and blood in order to compete for family property, otherwise the devil would have done something with the eldest son inheritance system. Moreover, blacksmiths have always had mediocre profits, far less so than wool and beer. Is this kid stupid? He actually doesn't want to be separated like this. Once separated, all family members are actually damaged, and once separated, the things he can do are greatly reduced. The difference between the East and the West in this system lies in property, which is divided equally in the East. The West takes everything, while other sons can only take some money and leave. In fact, the nobility are the strong supporters of this system. They can ensure that their territory is not weakened and maximize the protection of family interests. Matthew's classification can be considered Eastern. Andrew. Let's talk about it later. If we give you a blacksmith shop, what do you plan to do? Matthew smiled and said, "The blacksmith shop may seem to have average profits, but that's just because the market here is too small. How much profit can agricultural tools make?" My mother's voice came from downstairs. "Let's eat now." The father and son spoke in unison, "Come on." I saw it very clearly. Andrew said, "Keep talking." Matthew. I want to expand the scale, and the focus will also shift to weapon production in the future. Andrew Chi said, "We mainly produce swords and firearms. Who do we sell them to?" "Those nobles." Matthew's expression was strange. "I can also try producing artillery." Andrew immediately opposed, "They haven't made this thing before. Besides, copper is too expensive now and there are restrictions on trade quantities. This must be a loss-making transaction." Matthew smiled and said, "Maybe it can be made of iron." Andrew cursed, "The more you say it, the less reliable it becomes. I haven't heard that iron can still make cannons." End of this chapter. Chapter 2. Merchant Kings. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The source has no content or has errors. Chapter 3. The Hawkins family. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 3. The Hawkins family. The enclosure movement, which lasted for over 300 years since the 15th century, is very famous. But it's not serious yet. Because at this time, the entire UK had only a population of 4 or 5 million. And after the abolition of serfdom in the 15th century, there were a large number of self-employed farmers. How could Matthew not land for the problem 200 years from now? That's right, the main force of early enclosure was actually wealthy farmers, who became landlords when they became wealthy. This is a profit-driven process. Raising sheep to obtain wool, selling wool to earn money to buy more land, and then having more sheep. If you can't buy it, rent it, if you can't rent it, use violence to grab it. With the passage of time, various means have become increasingly severe, and the main force has become a privileged class. In the end, the state machinery is used for legal robbery. According to sources, in the mid-16th century, the land rented from nobles and monasteries was approximately £40 to £50 per year on 200 acres of land. Selling wool after raising sheep can earn an annual income of £300.400. However, prices had not yet risen significantly in 1509, and the number of wool profits was much smaller than in the middle and later stages. It needs to be divided by 3, which is about 1 or 200 gold coins. About enough to buy a small sailboat. Don't underestimate these numbers, they are all genuine gold coins with explosive purchasing power. The gold coins minted by King Henry VII are worth £1, weighing 15.55 grams, and have a purity of over 95%. It is said that if we only farm, a net income of £12 per year on 200 acres would be considered very good. Andrew was originally a self-farmer. Matthew suggested raising sheep when he was only 10 years old. The most crucial thing here is that someone has already made a fortune through the wool business. And Plymouth is a port, so there is no need to worry about selling. The trading ships of the Hanseatic League will take away everything they consider profitable. Early England was a place of raw material production, and wool was used for large-scale exports. Crossing the English Channel, the opposite Netherlands is the big buyer. Matthew. It all depends on human factors. He has money, but I lack it. So there's a possibility. Andrew snorted and said, I'm not short of money. Matthew quickly smiled and said, our family is short of money. Daisy. Just now you said. Double it. Matthew. We raise so many sheep and buy so much land. In the end, all the big money goes to woolen producers, woolen exporters, and the Netherlanders. Don't you want to change it? That's right, Matthew wants industrial upgrading. Andrew is not stupid, he actually had this kind of plan before. Unfortunately, many industries in this era are not something that everyone can do. The reason why privileged classes are more likely to succeed in their work is not because they have strong abilities, nor because they are more hardworking. But because they are a privileged class. Even the Hawkins were able to expand their wool business not simply because Matthew and Andrew had great abilities. The surname Hawkins is in Plymouth, it is a big surname with a large number of people. In an era without the rule of law, actions rely on promises and character. Fists and knives are the lowest level of security. Want to eat black? First, weigh your own weight and see if you can withstand retaliation. Even nobles are reluctant to provoke local snakes. But if your hands are too black, you act arrogantly, do not speak of reputation, and lack integrity. It doesn't go far either. This is also a kind of balance. Matthew certainly wants to go to London, and there is also a dispute for dominance within the Hawkins family. A noble status is enough to dispel the unwanted thoughts of those surnamed Hawkins. Danny has a friend named William, who is actually a distant relative and also named Hawkins. Their family used to be fishermen, but now they are engaged in maritime trade, making a considerable profit. Of course, there are also those surnamed Hawkins who have become butlers, distillery workers, artisans, and even hired tenants. For his impoverished distant relatives, Andrew is always willing to lend a hand and his wages are quite fair. In the afternoon, Matthew went to the manor. His landlord's son likes to focus on grain production. He needs to see if the barn is full this year's harvest. Self-sufficiency was a characteristic of English farmers in this era. Even if prices skyrocketed later, there was no food crisis, only a shortage of supply caused by hoarding. There were not many tenants, and they warmly greeted Matthew. "This is not Ma Shuchang's handsome outfit." But Andrew confiscated their lease for several years. The only condition is that the excess grain can only be sold to him at a fair price. "You don't have to pay a penny, you'll get a group of loyal supporters." Some tenants were even self-farmers like Andrew before. After Andrew generously donated, the land changed its owner, and the self-farmers improved their lives. Everything else seemed no different. Why not sell it? Needless to say, it's all Matthew's crazy ideas. The income from wool is stable, and the profit from grain is negligible. So every time Andrew organizes work such as deforestation, everyone is very proactive, not only providing free food and alcohol, but also earning some wages. Why not participate? Almost all of Andrew's grain is used for brewing. Alcohol was a necessity in the Middle Ages, and without reliable drinking water, wheat wine became a reliable source of drinking water for laborers. However, these beers cannot be sold in England. Almost all estates and even farmers brew wheat wine for their own use. So most of them have been sold to trading ships at the port, and their demand is not small at all. For example, every time William comes back, he only buys Andrew's wine and ships it on board. Because not only is the quality good, Andrew will also give him the lowest price. In fact, after delivering the goods to the destination, he sold the wine for a good price more than once. Matthew, accompanied by the estate manager Hawkins, looked and touched the barn. He also had a friendly conversation with tenant Hawkins. Finally, at the request of groom Hawkins, he looked at his foal. Okay, even his father can't figure out the origin of these distant relatives. This is a family network built by Andrew Hawkins with the help of his son Matthew. Many Hawkins rely on Andrew Hawkins' generosity, and Andrew did not disappoint them. Matthew said, "One response is our guarantee, and no one dares to touch our finger. Even the county magistrate cannot do it." Plymouth is located in the southwest of England and belongs to Devonshire. To the south is the intersection of the Atlantic and the English Channel, and 300 kilometers northeast is London. In the Age of Discovery, almost all British people set off from here and headed towards the ocean. They tread on the floating land, fight against the waves, and fight against the enemy. Defeat the Spanish invincible fleet, defeat Napoleon's French navy, and bombard the Arabs to liberate the white slaves. Traveling the world, leading the Industrial Revolution, and ultimately becoming an empire that never sets. However, in 1509, even the trade routes of this small country were controlled by the Lufthansa League, and it was just a raw material production site. No one imagines what will happen 300 years later. Matthew knows but can't see. His initial idea was to eat and drink without worrying about eating and waiting for death. He is not much taller than Napoleon now, but he is not considered short among the British. But his 17-year-old brother Danny is more than half a head taller than him, with muscles and bones all over his body. In order to eat and drink every day without worrying, and to protect his gold coins, he had to take a step further. Repeat the cycle. As she was preparing to go back, a girl shouted, "Matthew! Young master, I heard you're getting married." He certainly remembers his childhood companions. When he was a child, he didn't get along well with others. An adult and a little kid can't play together. But there are always some people whose kindness still lingers in his memory. Matthew thought for a moment and said, "No, not really. And I will go on a trip next spring. Would you be willing to go with me as a maid? This is not cheap. Do you remember?" The maid was able to become a queen in good name. The girl's heart was filled with joy, whether to be a peasant woman or a maid. Is it still necessary to choose? She was in joy from inside out, her footsteps still jumping a bit. "Of course I would. But where are you going?" Matthew said, "London." End of this chapter. Chapter 4. Too many ideas and too little money. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 4. Too many ideas and too little money, so far. Her mother chased after her. A man ran over and said, "Close your mouth. Young master, Eileen will go." Matthew looked at her parents and said, "If you agree, buy her some decent clothing that suits her status, at least 3 sets, and the payment." He took out a gold coin and said, "I'll pay for it." The man took it with a smile on his face and said, "I'm happy to help you." Matthew's expression was strange. "Of course, you can change your mind at any time, and you don't have to worry about coins. Just treat them as a gift to me, or compensation. When I was a child, I stole your chicken." Everyone present couldn't help but burst into laughter. How much is a gold coin worth? In the mid to late 16th century, when prices doubled, woolen production in England was already widespread. A weaver's daily income must not exceed 5 pence. A skilled craftsman earns around 9p a day. Many people have never seen gold coins in their lifetime, and their trade with each other is barter. Many people can eat and wear warm clothes, have sturdy houses to shelter from wind and rain, and land to cultivate or raise sheep. But without a penny. So, is currency really wealth? Matthew went to see the hydraulic mill again. This type of facility gradually disappeared only after the 19th century. It is the core facility of the farm. If you want to produce woolen fabric, the washing process is essential. High manual processing costs and low efficiency. Hydraulic machinery is essential. Matthew touched the spindle of the mill and looked at the wear and tear, very satisfied. We still need to build a few more buildings. It's another expense. Matthew rarely invents and creates, firstly because he doesn't quite understand these old antiques, and secondly because he doesn't need them at all. He said he wanted to use iron to make cannons because he had seen cast iron shells. With cast iron, it is natural for cast iron cannons to be available. In the future museums, there will be many of these things. In this era, copper is the mainstream material for artillery. In fact, the first cast iron cannon in Europe appeared in 1543. In fact, there is also a type of forged artillery that is hammered out. But England is now a remote area in Europe, and he has never seen it before. This type of gun is not sturdy and is prone to bursting. Far less reliable than copper. The Hawkins family does wool business, not only raising sheep in their own pens, but also purchasing them. Many self-cultivating farmers will raise a few or even a dozen heads. How much is uncertain. However, Matthew has found that the amount of wool purchased is decreasing. The reason is that many woolen merchants and producers have emerged in the southwestern counties of England. Although there is no news from further places yet, it is estimated to be similar. Unlike what modern people imagine, this form of production is family style. Rural areas are the main force in woolen production, while cities are extremely rare. Many so-called woolen merchants still have to do their own work. There are very few people like Andrew who have completely lost their jobs on a large scale. Is it a genius with a keen sense of the market that so many farmers make this choice in this era of information blockage? Not really. Do you remember the Merchant King? It was he who ordered a ban on the export of high-quality wool and only sold poor-quality wool to competitors. Encouraged the production of woolen fabrics to achieve higher profits. Then he can receive more taxes. In the area near Plymouth, Andrew collected a lot of idle wool, but other places did not by his account. This is not the era of free markets. So don't be fooled by the doubling of income this year, but Matthew has already felt the crisis. It can be said that it was rolled up in the 16th century. Wool exports will definitely become woolen exports in the future. Those who cannot keep up with this round of upgrading will be eliminated. According to Matthew's idea, he plans to win by scale. The first step is to hire 100 looms, or rather hand them over to 100 reliable families. The annual production of woolen fabrics can exceed 3,000 pieces. If there is still enough funds, he will purchase woolen fabric like buying wool. As long as there is scale, it can reduce costs and affect pricing. Do you want to organize a guild? Forget it, let's talk about it later. Nowadays, it is rare for these so-called woolen merchants to have more than a dozen weaving machines. At that time, they will be no match at all. The only problem is a lack of money. Upon returning home, Matthew put his plan together and presented it. Although Andrew agreed, he was not in a hurry. Do you think the wool business won't continue in the future? Don't worry, I can sell any amount of wool. Matthew. No, what worries me is that in the future, woolen producers on the European continent will no longer buy wool. Andrew said strangely. How could that happen? Matthew. It's simple, they won't have a price advantage. Although there are still a few years, maybe even longer, they won't be able to compete with England in the end. And smuggling wool will make the king unhappy. It's better not to do it. That's why Andrew wanted to make woolen goods but didn't take action. William's trading ship sometimes carries Andrew's high-quality wool. Is this a crime? No, this is one of the reasons why European kings were later sidelined by capitalists. The conflict between monarchy and capital lies in this. Capital naturally dislikes control. Even if Matthew understands that this is actually not right, but holding so much wool in his hand, he wants to drink the wind because of this ban. Especially for the Hawkins family, transporting wool out is an easy task. Wharf officials, customs supervisors, and a group of people are all old friends of the Andrew family, some even surnamed Hawkins. What Matthew didn't know was that the person who would establish the slave triangle trade in the future also had the surname Hawkins. Plymouth is one of these triangles. Andrew. Have you ever thought about us producing our own weaving machines? Matthew. I've thought about it, but there are too many problems, the stall is too big, and it's easy to capsize. Let's start with the artillery. Andrew. Do you really think that when the king sees a new type of artillery, he will lend you money? Matthew smiled and said, regardless of whether we have artillery or not, as long as he thinks we have the ability to repay the money, he may pay. Andrew understood a bit, but not enough. Because we can't run. Matthew smiled and said, not only. He's a debtor who can't be relied on. Andrew also smiled, Matthew's words were too fundamental. Andrew occasionally lends money to acquaintances, but at Matthew's insistence, not charging high interest rates is not conducive to rolling profits. This has earned Andrew a considerable reputation. Matthew thought for a moment and said, it's better to have a new type of artillery than not. If we had another new type of sailboat. Andrew immediately stared and said, do you still want to build a ship? Matthew smiled and said, we definitely need to do it in the future. Let's start with a model for now. Remember, the old king likes to play with the navy, and the new king will also like it. Andrew was puzzled and said, how do you know? Matthew. We are an island nation. If Henry VIII doesn't like these, it just means he's a fool. England is completely ruined. Andrew, who is illiterate, has extraordinary ability to become the local leader of Plymouth just based on his son's advice. But he never thought about building a ship. He stared again and said, are you not afraid that the stall will be too big and eventually capsize? Matthew. It's too early to say these things. Let's wait until I've been to London. Andrew sighed and said, you've been smart since you were young, and I hope you're right. I've found a helper for you with excellent swordsmanship. He can protect your safety on the way to London. Matthew. English people. Andrew. Of course, he learned the swordsmanship of the Fay and Lay schools. I estimate he has been outside for quite some time. Matthew. Worth trust. Andrew. His home is in Plymouth, and I know him as well. Matthew frowned and said, besides swordsmanship, what else can he do? Andrew. It seems like he even worked as a sailor. Matthew nodded and said, sailor. That's great. I'll have a conversation with him. Daisy's voice came from downstairs. Andrew, it's time for dinner. Matthew. The father and son spoke in unison, come on. End of this chapter. Chapter 5. Freedom and Privileges. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 5 Freedom and Privileges. The next morning, Matthew got on his horse and was going to work. Both blacksmiths and distilleries are not close to the farm. For the convenience of transportation and sales, they are all located in Plymouth. There is a division of labor between father and son, and Matthew is responsible for management. His father specializes in managing various relationships. Matthew has never attended school, but he has attended short-term schools like training classes. A person who considers himself knowledgeable can travel around as a teacher, making a living by imparting knowledge and teaching people how to write. If someone is willing to pay, then stay. If the flow of money is continuous, then stay for a long time. If he is favored by some nobles, he may become a hired teacher for noble families. The salary is certainly not low. Even if it's not worth it, being hired by a local government official as a document is also a good choice. So the upper limit of this profession is very high, and it is possible to enter or exit the palace. The lower limit is also very low, maybe we have to go to the dock to carry big bags and temporarily make a living. As for going to the monastery, it also requires money, and I will try my best to carry your private goods. Matthew never considered it. On the contrary, it is these mobile scholars that interest him more. Because this is one of his ways to understand the 16th century. Matthew has studied English, but he can only and must pretend to be illiterate. Because many modern English vocabulary and even grammar did not exist in the 16th century. Many meanings are about 500,000 to 900,000. During Shakespeare's time, there were only about 140,000 English words. In modern times, there are approximately 600,000 to 1 million. So, this literary giant is definitely considered semi-illiterate in modern times. Even the same word with identical letters has completely different meanings. For example, freedom and privilege. Teacher. Freedom and privilege are synonymous. Young Matthew cursed in his heart, "Are you a scammer here to cheat money?" Teacher. Privilege is freedom. Young Matthew couldn't help but say, how could freedom be a privilege? The teacher smiled and said, with privilege, there is freedom. To have freedom, the prerequisite is to have privilege. Although freedom is not all privilege, having privilege necessarily means having freedom. Young man, do you understand? Of course, young Matthew didn't understand, and his mind was filled with a paste. This must be a scammer. After attending several more training classes, Matthew had to admit it. At least in the early 16th century, freedom and privilege were indeed synonymous. He even remembered a movie that shouted for freedom and died. Nima is too funny. Time really changes everything. However, Matthew remembered Levi's contemplation at night. A long time ago, I learned this. The bright moonlight in front of the bed, I wonder if it's frost aground looking up, I find the moon bright bowing, in homesickness I'm drowned. I only realized when I grew up that this was not the original text at all. The original text recorded in the song Dynasty reads as follows. Looking at the moonlight in front of the bed, I wonder if it's frost aground looking up at the mountains and moon, bowing, in homesickness I'm drowned. The problem is that even if he knows he has been deceived, he still believes that the revised version is better. And then there's the question again, are these intentional or unintentional tampering and modifications correct? Matthew doesn't know. However, he understood better what someone meant by saying that all history is contemporary history. The distillery may sound tall and upscale, but if it were a workshop, you would feel mediocre. People who play with words have many ways to create a sense of freshness and inclination. When describing the West, they change a lot of vocabulary. Replace farmer with farmer. Village village, replace it with a manor farm. However, replacing feces with indescribable things would not be useful, so it was not written. In this way, a pastoral scene full of exotic charm and grandeur is vividly depicted on paper. But I can't do it without writing. Because the distillery is not within the city. The reason is that there are too many indescribable things from various sources in the city. Matthew thinks so. You need to find a clean water source to make wine, right? In this era, health issues are undoubtedly one of his most important decision-making considerations. There are too many and too frequent epidemics in this era. A few years ago, there was also a case of sweating fever, which resulted in a death rate of over 30%. Matthew suspected that this was how Henry VIII and his brother hung up. After inspecting for a while, Matthew went to the warehouse to check the inventory and found that it was almost empty. The steward immediately explained, Captain Jack picked up 140 barrels early in the morning. The payment for the goods was not small, and the procedures were complete. I heard he bought another ship. The so-called Captain Jack is Danny's good friend William and his father. The one who runs maritime trade. Andrew's good friend, another Hill of the Hawkins family. Matthew nodded and casually asked, where are they going this time? Netherland. Steward. I asked, but he didn't say anything. Monsieur's face remained expressionless, but he felt dissatisfied in his heart. He asked, the production capacity is clearly insufficient now. What suggestions do you have? The steward immediately said, continue to expand production and hire a few more people. Our liquor has always been in short supply. Matthew. You can do it as you please. But first, go and inquire about whose wine cannot be sold. As long as the condition is good, buy it at a low price. The steward immediately opposed, young master. Their production process is chaotic and not very particular. Even if the wine is fine, the taste is not good. It will ruin our brand. Matthew. There's a comparison, it can definitely be sold elsewhere. Don't use the name of the Hawkins family. Once this is done, we'll raise the price of our wine by 10%. Then we'll sell the purchased wine at the normal price. The steward stared wide-eyed, trying to understand the meaning in Matthew's words. Matthew. If my dear Uncle Jack comes again, give him a discount at the new price. The steward was immediately stunned. Matthew put on his hat and was ready to leave as soon as he left the warehouse. At the door, some old employees bowed to him, and Matthew immediately called out their names and stopped chatting for a while. The steward was also added, and he used to be one of them. Soon someone said new news. Young master, I heard that Scotland has a very strong wine, like those sold in monasteries, but not wine. Someone interjected, is it the water of life? No, it's not the kind used by those scammers. The so-called water of life refers to high alcohol, later referring to high alcohol. At this time, the British Isles were still Catholic territory, with monasteries scattered throughout the country. The quantity is as high as over 600 in England alone. But if you see them as mere religious facilities, you are wrong. This is an economy that controls a large amount of land and monopolizes the production of wine, high alcohol, and alcohol, as well as taxes. For many years, alcohol has been used as a miracle medicine, although it is not claimed to cure all diseases, it is also about the same. Later, there was a quack doctor named Arnold or something. During treatment, alcohol was sprayed all over the patient's body and wrapped in textile. Without any accidents, the fire caught unexpectedly in the end. So the patient's screams became famous in history, and alcohol also became notorious. Matthew. Do you know how it is brewed? Everyone knows that this young master likes to listen to various anecdotes, even if there is no end to it. This kind of chat is also one of Matthew's ways of collecting information. Matthew had thought about brewing spirits and alcohol, but in this era, Catholic monasteries monopolized the production of high alcohol and wine. If you offend them, there may be a stake waiting for you. Why bother? However, it shouldn't be a problem to create some for personal use, should it? Matthew couldn't help but look at these old employees, recalling who had the strictest mouth among them. However, this requires someone to propose the idea of distillation. As long as he thinks he has his own contribution, then invest and give him some share. This way, you can harvest a hard-working old scalper. As soon as I thought of this, someone said, I heard that ordinary wine is burned with fire, and then the wine gas is collected to obtain a stronger wine. Someone suddenly said, how did you know? Matthew's eyes lit up and he was the one. If he had to, Matthew wouldn't even want to enter the city, but the blacksmith shop was near the port. This is actually a mistake, because the blacksmith shop originally envisioned customers as sailors, but did not expect that agricultural tools were the main source of traffic. Because the market is also nearby. The locals are going out to sea, and the weapons have been prepared long ago, maybe they are still passed down from ancestors. Foreign people entering the port have already bought their weapons, unless they accidentally fall into the sea. Riding a horse with a handkerchief covering his nose and swaggering through the market. The image of a pampered wealthy young master immediately took root in people's hearts. The follower walked ahead and led the horse, while Matthew looked cautiously to both sides. Some of the houses here were two-story. Generally speaking, it is normal for someone to randomly dispose of various types of sewage, even indescribable things. But it seems that I have good luck today. The port area is actually much cleaner. Because foreign sailors are more cautious in unfamiliar places. As a fear of the epidemic, locals rarely come here unless necessary. At the blacksmith's shop, you can clearly see the ships in the port. The so-called port is a place where some wood is nailed to the water and covered with wooden boards to allow people to leave. It's quite rudimentary. However, Matthew enjoys observing these small boats the most. For example, the Kirk ship of the Hanseatic League over there is estimated to have 180 tons. This type of ship has a long history and used to be the main merchant ship of the Hanseatic League. Many European countries have manufactured it. However, the Portuguese caravel triangular sailboat over there is the most worth seeing. This 100-ton sailboat is a new type of ship known for its easy handling and fast speed. In other places, there are small boats weighing 70.80 tons or even less than 50 tons. No way, in the first few years of the 16th century, the largest ship type in Europe was only 400 tons. But Matthew's biggest concern is not this, he is concerned about the lifespan of these ships. Based on his years of understanding, most of these small boats have a lifespan of only 4 to 5 years. Even if the shipowner is willing to spend money on maintenance and careful construction, the maximum lifespan is only 10 to 8 years. Of course, there are also a very small number of XIN who can last longer. What is this? This is a natural mandatory scrap. Matthew sighed, it was a pity not to earn such a large sum of money. End of this chapter. Chapter 6. The Pampered Matthew. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 6. The Pampered Matthew. The blacksmith shop seems to have nothing to say, at least there is still profit. However, just as Matthew was about to say something. The blacksmith has something to say, he's ready to quit. This half dead. Matthew was not surprised, but he still asked, can you explain the reason? Blacksmith. It was said that weapons and swords were the main tools, but now I have been working with shovel and hoe all day. I even think my craftsmanship has gone backwards. In the early 16th century, blacksmiths were definitely high-tech talents, and there were many famous and wealthy weapon craftsmen. The upper limit of this profession is also very high, at least there is no need to carry a big bag at the lower limit. No matter how much the book praises the history of Western ironware. Iron cooking tools are prominently listed on Edward III's list of treasures in the 14th century. That is to say, if you have an iron pot, at least in terms of treasures, you are not inferior to Edward III. If there are still a few spoons left, he can only bow down to you. Matthew did not stop the core talents from resigning, anyway, the apprentices of agricultural tools could handle it. However, it is still a pity to allow talents to leave. So he threw a bait and said, "I'm very sorry to hear this news, but I won't forcefully stop you. As I said, you're free to come and go. I originally had a technical question today that I wanted to ask for advice, so it seems I have to ask someone else." Technical issues. The blacksmith has shown interest. This young master from the Hawkins family still has a good impression of him. What is it? I haven't left yet, I just expressed my thoughts. Matthew chuckled inwardly and said expressionlessly, "Next year I plan to expand the blacksmith shop to have the ability to produce cast iron shells. I want to ask some questions about cast iron. You know, many captains now buy some spare parts. Cast iron shells appeared in the 15th century, but at that time, countries still extensively used stone shells. Compared to stone shells, the manufacturing of cast iron shells is much easier. The density of cast iron is 2 to 3 times that of stone. So, under the same volume, the increase in impact force can be imagined. But when you think about it with your knees, you know how much effort it takes to round the stone, and the cost is actually not low. Cast iron requires at least a specialized furnace to melt a certain amount of iron into molten iron, and then pour the molten iron into a specially designed mold to cool and shape it. Open the model, clean and polish the edges and burrs, and a round cast iron shell is complete. It can be seen that this process is different from using iron to make swords, and cannot be considered the same type of work. There are still doubts about whether this person understands or not. Expanding scale. Cast iron shells. The blacksmith coughed and said, "Mr. Hawkins, you know, I come from Sussex, which was the first place in England to master the technology of cast iron shells. I started as an apprentice by trimming the edges of cast iron shells, and although I haven't led the work, I know the entire production process very well. Technical talents are indeed quite easy to handle, as long as they are pleasing to the eye. Have you never eaten pork, only seen pigs run? No problem, it's better than not even seeing a pig. Besides, Matthew really doesn't think this thing has much technical content." With a smile, he said, "So, are you not planning to resign?" The blacksmith choked and said, "Yes, but I insist on not giving up on the production of swords. On the contrary, the production of agricultural tools and plows should be separated from these. When customers see these exquisite swords, they suddenly discover a pile of agricultural tools over there, so naturally there won't be any good reviews. Not bad, I actually know consumer psychology." Matthew never thought these things were too advanced. After all, there are different perspectives. Due to conceptual issues, he even feels that agricultural tools are more important. Blacksmiths are hired, which is different from the situation in distilleries. But over a year has already revealed a person's character. It must be tied tightly. Matthew. Are you still single now? The blacksmith is far away from his hometown, firstly because he is the second son, and secondly because his wife passed away and has no children. Thirdly, the Hawkins family is willing to pay for employment. I would like to introduce you to a marriage. You have lost your wife, and some women in the Hawkins family have also lost their husbands. As long as you agree, someone will come to you for discussion. First of all, it may be one of my cousins or even further away. This is not Matthew's idea, it is the usual practice of this era, and it is direct. I want to marry you, do you agree? As for women, unless they have sufficient wealth and freedom, their marriage is determined by their parents. However, it also depends on whether the woman's family has a strong sense of kinship. Many parents also seek their daughters' opinions. Some religious figures point out that a woman's chastity is not under her own control, but rather under the control of elders led by her father, so she cannot decide her own marriage. As for why Matthew could decide on a widow's marriage, it's very simple. In a world where even a queen can remarry for 6 months, the concept of marriage is different from modern times. This is a good thing for the widow of the Hawkins family. Blacksmiths belong to the high-paying class, and it is not difficult to continue playing. Widows are usually happy to find a new man. Similar incidents of eating out of households are not limited to the East. Without the protection of men, women will only struggle to survive. It's not life is inherently difficult. So this is not someone being ruthless, but the world being ruthless. Matthew heard a story. There was a young fisherman fishing in the nearshore, and when a storm came, he drove a small fishing boat home. However, not far from home, the boat capsized. His wife watched her husband drown with her own eyes on the shore. In grief, she also jumped into the sea and died immediately. In this era, death is often a form of liberation. But even if the oath is fragile, it is much stronger than being helpless. The blacksmith immediately agreed. The previous resignation was inherently risky, and if you refuse this, you'll never know what you'll encounter. Although this young master is nice, his father is not a good person. I don't want to forcefully stop you, is not a pretentious empty talk. It's just not wanting. Besides, he doesn't want to refuse either. The Hawkins family is a nice big tree. Then Matthew took out a piece of parchment from his pocket and said, "This is a design I accidentally got. You can try to make it if you have nothing to do." On parchment paper, there is a slender sword with a gorgeous guard. The blacksmith is illiterate but recognizes numbers. Blade length: 44 inches. Matthew shrugged and said, "Maybe it's a bit longer, maybe it's a bit shorter. You can do whatever you want." The blacksmith smiled and said, "This sword looks really gorgeous. Who designed it? Is the handguard too complicated?" Matthew shrugged and said, "Gorgeous is the only way to get a good price. Simplicity may be more practical, you can do it yourself." The blacksmith has entered a state and said, "Can I put some decorations on it? I've even figured out the patterns." Matthew: "You can do it yourself, I think." The blacksmith ignored him and turned around to start selecting iron materials. Matthew is very tolerant of people who can focus on their work. Leaving the blacksmith shop, he prepared to go to the tavern and sit down. Suddenly, the blacksmith shouted, "Young master, the center of gravity of this weapon is too far back, the front end is too slender, and it has almost no armor-piercing ability. Are you sure the blueprint is correct?" Matthew smiled and said, "Don't worry, this is a decoration." The blacksmith exclaimed, "What? Decorations? Alright, can you give me a gold coin? It would be more appropriate to decorate it with gold." Matthew took out a gold coin and threw it with his hand. The blacksmith caught it, but walked over again and said, "There's one more thing." Matthew: "What?" The blacksmith felt a bit embarrassed and said, "It's so unique. Can I name it?" Matthew thought for a moment and said, "Are you sure this kind of sword doesn't exist in the world?" Blacksmith: "Although it's a bit like an Italian stab sword, I'm sure Europe doesn't have this kind of long sword." Matthew laughed and said, "Maybe it's just a piece of trash and not useful at all. What if it becomes a joke?" Blacksmith: "No, not really." He lifted the iron material in his hand and seemed to have a long sword in his hand. "I just imagined many single-handed weapons, but none of them should have an advantage in front of this kind of long sword. It's just a name, Matthew doesn't care. Whatever you want, you can do it yourself." The blacksmith was overjoyed, and then things happened again. This type of iron material is not suitable for it. I think better materials should be used, and using Toledo's production may be better. Matthew finally couldn't help but say, you can do it yourself, as long as the cost is not too outrageous. I suggest you use this to practice your hands first. Stay away from the busy blacksmith. Matthew is going to the tavern to meet the skilled swordsman. This is not specifically in a tavern, but rather a public space that was one of the few places in Europe from the Middle Ages to the 19th century where aristocratic merchants, scholars, workers, sailors, and other social classes could gather. In the early 16th century, ordinary people in England were unable to drink spirits. The various spirits of the church are only aimed at the wealthy in the upper class to maximize profits. Even the King of Scotland couldn't bear to drink too much whiskey, and there were only a few pubs in England selling spirits. However, Matthew doesn't want to drink anything at this tavern. He brought his own beer and a glass. Because he really can't drink it, and he doesn't want to use those dirty and strange drinking utensils. Glass cups were still considered luxury goods at this time. Many cups are carved from wood and cannot be washed clean naturally. What's even more unbearable for him is that the same glass of wine may be enjoyed by several people who may not even know each other. Even if Matthew didn't pay much attention, he could only keep a respectful distance. Refusing people thousands of miles away became his only choice. If there is a choice, he doesn't even want to go into this damn place. The spoiled, eccentric son of the Andrew family. That's him. End of this chapter. Chapter 7. The Flashy Robert. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 7. The Flashy Robert taverns are not the property of the Hawkins family. Plymouth is a small town jointly managed by multiple local families, without even a lord in the 16th century. The later Earl of Devonshire will have to wait another 100 years. The so-called prefects are actually elected. These families, under intermarriage, were relatively harmonious and controlled everything in Plymouth. What Matthew didn't know was that over 100 years later, the local powers of Plymouth united and resisted the siege of the Royalists for 4 years in the later English Civil War. Andrew arranged a marriage for Matthew, and his family is in the soap business. What prospects can soap makers have? The production of soap is very simple, with only fats and alkaline substances needed. In the UK, sheep oil often turns into soap in the end, and plant ash is everywhere. This industry is an inevitable product of the rise of the wool industry. Unfortunately, people in this era don't take showers much, so it's just a small business. Rather than calling it a marriage alliance, it's more about wanting a reliable source of sheep oil. Matthew's view is always at a loss. Not only do they sell sheep oil at a low price, but they also sell their color scheme. So when his ambition was unleashed, Andrew immediately felt that he was at a loss. How could my future noble son, who is so powerful, marry the daughter of a small businessman? The marriage came to an abrupt end. Many people often don't talk about methods when facing their own elders. What Lousy says to his son often has ulterior motives, especially in wealthy families. The attendant respectfully poured a glass of beer for Matthew, then put it down and stood behind him. A person dressed in flashy clothes leaned over and said, "Excuse me, are you Mr. Matthew Hawkins?" "I came as scheduled." "You can call me Robert." Matthew looked up and saw the person wearing a large and exaggerated hat, adorned with feathers, tight pants, and bright socks. He is wearing a shirt with fluffy sleeves and a leather vest, and there is also a short sword on his waist. The first impression is like a king in playing cards. Matthew exclaimed, "Have you ever been a mercenary?" In the 16th century, only mercenaries would dress like birds. Many European countries have regulations for dress codes. Mercenaries are not included in this list. They are thugs of powerful organizations. These golden servants had brilliant military achievements, even looting Rome in 1527. Robert. It's not the kind of mercenary you think. I didn't join those organizations, I just wandered around with some friends for a few years. Turns out to be an adventurer. Due to the striking style of mercenaries, many people will imitate them. He is a leader in 16th century fashion. In this era, there are more adventurers, and their composition is complex, mainly consisting of light criminals, fugitives, aristocratic children excluded from inheritance rights, farmers unwilling to farm, and so on. The upper limit of this profession is Duke Rich, and the lower limit is to die without any surviving bones, which is quite attractive. This Robert has a rich experience. Matthew extended a hand and gestured, "Please sit down. Would you like a glass?" The attendant immediately took out a glass and placed it on the table. Robert glanced at the attendant and saw that he was just a simple and honest young man, so he no longer cared. He sat down without hesitation, picked up the wine jug, and poured it himself. "You are younger than I thought, a bit unexpected. What are you wearing, and what is the name of this hat?" Matthew smiled and said, "It's just a felt hat and a woolen coat." Robert: No, I seem to have never seen this style of felt hat before." Matthew picked up the glass and said, "Don't you think it's similar in style to your hat? It's just a feather gone." Robert quickly understood the meaning of raising his glass and picked it up, saying, "I like how you dress." Matthew chuckled lightly and the two clinked a glass. With a crisp, ding, sound, everyone in the tavern turned their heads to watch. Robertson felt even more confident and determined to get a set of glassware. Matthew's clothing is actually not something he can do. If you want to wear it comfortably, design and cutting are very important. There are only a few types of fabrics in this era, and the reason why wool felt and woolen fabric can last for hundreds of years is precisely because they are useful, durable, easy to wear, and durable. The latitude of the UK is equivalent to Heilongjiang. Even if there is a warming ocean, the temperature cannot be much higher. Matthew: Have you ever been a sailor? Where have you been? Robert: Yes, but it hasn't been long. I worked as a bodyguard in Netherlands and have also been to Stockholm, France, and Iberia. Of course, I have also been to Florence and Venice, as far as West Africa. I wanted to go to America, but I couldn't go. Has this taken almost all the coasts of Europe? Matthew took a sip of beer and said, "Why did you come back?" Robert: I already have enough money, so I don't have to take any more risks. Matthew smiled with a meaningful look in his eyes and said, "Although London is not far, there are still quite a few homeless people nowadays. They hide in the wilderness, and robbery is also common. In fact, they are also taking risks." Robert also slowly smiled and said, "I want to do some business. The Hawkins family is a good partner. So, I need your trust." Interesting. Ma Shudao said, "I already have a lot of business, and I feel like I can't get busy anymore." Robert: No, you don't need to operate. I want to buy a boat and do business in West Africa. The Hawkins just need to invest and wait for a share. Matthew is interested in investing in trading merchant ships. This era should be profitable, but the risks are also not small. What kind of business can one do when going to West Africa? Robert: You should have heard that the Portuguese have been trafficking in people over the years, and there are also many black-skinned slaves in the Netherlands. And I happen to know a wealthy businessman from Netherlands and an African chieftain. Matthew was stunned and said, "Black slave trade." Robert smiled and said, "This vocabulary is good, very accurate." Matthew was a bit confused. He knew about human trafficking, but did the trafficking of black slaves already exist in 1509? Matthew pondered for a moment and said, "I really want to tell you to come back from London, but I must tell you that I will never invest in any human trafficking business." Robert was a bit surprised and said, "Mr. Hawkins. Can I call you by your name?" Matthew spread his hand and gestured. Matthew. Can you tell me why? Matthew. People have principles. Although I am not a moral gentleman, population trade has exceeded my bottom line. Robert. Well. But what I mean is. Why wasn't it the first sentence? Matthew picked up the beer and said, merchants should also have principles. Paying attention to reputation is the most important principle. Robert nodded and said, I understand. But Matthew, I think you may have some misunderstandings about the profession of a businessman. Matthew shrugged and said, so what I said should be. I can only guarantee that I will adhere to these principles. Robert lifted his glass and also learned to collide with Matthew. He smiled and said, just let me know when you're ready to leave. Anyway, I'll accompany you to London. Considering your honesty, I also want to tell you the truth. My money is indeed sufficient, but if something happens, it will be worthless. So, I just want to share the risk. In the era of great navigation, shipwrecks were not uncommon and were a common occurrence. Matthew nodded, this is a successful adventurer. Buy a new ship, fill it with cargo supplies, and hire sailors. Without a few £100, one cannot afford it. During the Tudor dynasty, purchasing a small boat of around 100 tons would cost approximately £100 to £200 depending on the specific situation. No matter how large the ship is, the average tonnage is only about 1.2 pounds. However, please note that the pound at this time was 15.55 grams of gold, while the gold coins issued by Florence during the same period were only 3.5 grams. Basically, you can calculate Henry VII's £100 as 200,000 renminbi. Smaller ships are also available, but the smaller the tonnage, the more dangerous long-distance navigation is. The risk rises sharply. So much so that later, the Spanish-American fleet only accepted ships with a capacity of 100 tons or more and a crew of no less than 32 people. In the early 16th century, 100 tons was already a good tonnage. Even in the later stages, there were not many large tonnage ocean-going merchant ships. In the era of great navigation in the 16th century, the tonnage of sailboats was a massive number of small vessels, less than 150 tons, many medium-sized vessels, less than 500 tons, and a few large sailboats, less than 1,000 tons. There are also larger ones, which will increase in the late 16th century. Even in the 19th century, the average tonnage of American ships was only over 200 tons. For example, Seville, Spain can only transport less than 450 tons, and no matter how large it is, it cannot enter. London is better, but there are records that a large ship carrying 900 tons ran aground. Matthew. If you have nothing to do in winter, welcome to the Hawkins estate. My younger brother is eager to go on adventures, but he is too young and not skilled. You can teach him something practical. I will pay a reasonable reward for it. Robert's eyes lit up and he realized that this job was too suitable. There was no risk and he could earn money. I can still get along well with the Hawkins family. Agree immediately. After leaving the tavern, Matthew was ready to go back, maybe he could still make it for dinner. Shipbuilding requires professional talents, and of course, Plymouth has shipyards. Or workshops. There is more than one. Unfortunately, our main business is fishing boats and small sampans. In this era, shipbuilding relies entirely on the experience of shipbuilding workers, drawings. Don't think about it, even measurements and numbers may not be useful. Palm gestures are the most common way. So, experienced boatmen are the ones we must look for. Matthew touched his chin and his eyes began to waver. Should he hire someone for a high salary? End of this chapter. Chapter 8. The First Snow of Winter. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 8. The First Snow of Winter. Plymouth has many shipbuilders, but no large ships have ever been built here. As for Matthew, besides those crazy people who prepare to travel all day, who would know how to build wooden boats in modern times. But he knows what the future sailing battleships will be like. There are also brainless common sense such as, artillery under deck, good stability is necessary to resist wind and waves, and, streamline speed is fast. He didn't even know that warships manufactured 200 years later could have a lifespan of up to 50 years. Instead of being built in the past few months and then scattered in 4 or 5 years. Any job is a discipline. However, the best solution for ocean-going trade is indeed to find a group of people to share the risk. And everyone on board, including sailors, has a share of trade profits. Without high income, ghosts go to sea at their own risk. Those who contribute money are called capital investments, while those who contribute are called labor investments. Having more people contribute money is called diversified investment. But the nearshore is not that complicated. The English Channel, whether heading north to Amsterdam in Netherlands or Bordeaux in South France, is very convenient to travel back and forth for half a month. For example, his dear Uncle Jack, the ship is only 70 tons old and worn out, and the newly purchased ship is also 70 tons. How much money can you earn even if you have a share to help people transport goods? The big money was earned by other shippers and Andrew. Beer can be considered a water supplement. I sold the supplement, isn't it too much? That's why Matthew was dissatisfied. There were only a few people on 2 70-ton boats, drinking 140 barrels on the way. Is this going to take a shower? However, even if there is a price difference at the ports along the way, beer cannot be earned much, it's just a small amount of money. It is common to double the profits of ocean trade, and a 30% margin is usually very good for European coastal areas. But it also depends on the product, such as velvet. That's why Uncle Jack works part-time as a pirate. To subsidize household expenses and provide compensation for the families of sailors who died unexpectedly. That's right, pirate ships are not big in this era, they value mobility. Often it only weighs over 100 tons, which means both doing business and robbing. I haven't arrived home yet, and the meal has already passed. After all, the estate is not close to Plymouth, and there is only one horse. The attendants walk, but of course it won't be fast. Matthew took out the bread from the saddle bag and patted it with his entourage. From afar, a group of people were chopping down trees at the edge of the pasture. Attendant. The master is asking them to chop down trees again. There are benefits to being far away, at least wood doesn't have to be bought at all. When I bought this piece of land, it was extremely cheap because there were too many forests, so I had to cut it down in order to graze and farm. The corpses of various large trees are everywhere, some of which have been lying for several years. Some were sold, while others were dismembered and put into the stove. In early 16th century England, wood was unsold without bidding. It was not until the 18th century, when the forest coverage in England decreased by 10%, that a large amount of timber began to be imported. Matthew. Can these woods be used for shipbuilding? Attendant. Of course, the drier the wood, the more suitable it is for shipbuilding. Matthew. How do you know? Attendant. As my father said, he has built many ships. Matthew exclaimed, Can your father build a ship? Attendant. Yes, but he has been dead for several years. Matthew. Well, people's lifespan is not long these days. Matthew. Can you help me inquire who has the best shipbuilding skills in Plymouth? The attendant suddenly stopped and Ma Dun snorted. He turned around and said, I think it's me. Matthew almost fell off the horse, this cow skin is blowing. Have you ever built a boat? Of course, from the moment I was born, I watched my grandfather and father build ships. Later, when I could walk, I became their assistant. Later, when my grandfather died, I became my father's assistant. Matthew suddenly remembered, aren't you a homeless man from Exeter? Exeter is a small coastal town in the eastern part of Devonshire. Of course, in Matthew's view, all of Europe is small towns. The servant was eating bread with a calm expression and said, Yes. Business is good, someone wants to buy it. My father didn't want it. Later, they were all killed, so I had to run away and finally arrived at Plymouth. Matthew was skeptical. How could he still have such a background? However, what he said has no flaws, and there is no need to deceive him. After all, it is a donkey or a horse that can be easily identified. Children in this era do not go to school, and it is only natural for them to help their families from a young age. Some small shipyards only have a few people. Family-style workshops are very common. So a person in their early 20s who claims to know how to build a ship is not necessarily bragging. As for the fact that buying and selling do not lead to murder, there is no doubt about the characteristics of the times. Kings and nobles rob everywhere, and it is not uncommon for aristocratic children who have lost their inheritance rights to become robbers. Even the teaching emperor is selling redemption vouchers. As for homeless people, they usually stay away from ruling institutions and aristocratic territories. After all, the enclosure movement has been going on for many years. Henry VII also promulgated corresponding laws, which stated that wandering and begging is a crime, and that people should be arrested. This is also considered a Western tradition. Is it high-paying poaching? Or do you cultivate it yourself? Matthew already has the answer. A dual approach, because in many jobs, two people are more efficient. Matthew. If you're willing, tomorrow you can find a knowledgeable helper and find a good place near the port to build a small fishing boat for me to see. You can use any wood here, and if you need tools, go to the blacksmith's shop. Remember to keep an account. Matthew, this is just putting on a show first. If it's really not possible, we can change people. In this era, a small shipyard was a suitable location by the seaside, and a small cabin was used for tools, meals, rest, and sleep, with nothing else. Shipbuilding is mostly done outdoors, and the key is to have multiple sheds to block the rain. The attendant thought for a moment and said, "No need for tomorrow, let's do it now, but you need to give me some money first." Now. Matthew couldn't help but twitch his lips, but in the end he asked, "How much do you want?" The attendant calculated and said, "Give me 80 gold coins first." Matthew almost choked on the bread and took 2 sips of water, saying, "It's just a small fishing boat. How could it be so much? This number may buy 2 small boats of 30 tons. The attendant said with a simple and honest expression, "A 120-ton fast ocean-going fishing boat, fully loaded, may be able to shake off pirates." Matthew Dackey. A 120-ton ocean-going fishing boat. Are you lying to me? In this era? Is there such a thing in England? The attendant remained simple and honest. Have you ever heard of Newfoundland's fishing grounds? Matthew thought for a moment, but actually remembered a rumor. In 1497, a navigator named Capote discovered the Newfoundland fishing grounds. It is said that even if they fell into the sea, they could step on the fish's back and land there, or just use a basket to catch them, and so on. This kind of Jianghu rumor should not be too much in the era of great navigation. Many times, it's just talk and talk nonsense. However, this fishing ground really exists, and it is said that in recent years, British fishermen have also gone there, always returning with a full load. Newfoundland Island in North America is approximately 3,700 kilometers away from Plymouth. In the 16th century, cod from Newfoundland fishing grounds was the main source of protein for Europeans. You're not mistaken, it's the main thing. Later on, it wasn't just the UK. France, Spain, and Portugal have organized fishing fleets to catch fish. The profit can be seen within it. Matthew had no intention of going to the sea to catch fish. But it seems pretty good. Uncle Jack doesn't know if he's willing to return to his old job. As for what kind of ocean-going fishing vessel, it is actually not much different from trade vessels. In this era, ships did not have professional division of labor. Matthew. So, you designed this ship specifically for running Newfoundland? Attendant. It wasn't designed by me, it was my father. Matthew fell silent. The attendant was also very silent. Finally, Matthew lifted his head and said, "I don't have that much gold on me, so let's go home first." Attendant. Matthew chuckled lightly and said, "When you have a lot of money, you can do a lot of things, right?" Returning to the thatched cottage mansion, the attendant quickly left with the gold coins. However, after some thought, Matthew still found two people to temporarily assist him. After all, we still have to afford a wooden house, and there is still a lot of preparation work. Of course, he would never admit that it was because the three of them were easy to supervise each other. When the first snow of this year arrived, bad news came. Jack Hawkins has never returned. There are rumors that he was arrested at a certain port and his ship was also detained. However, it was quickly clarified that a group of pirates had defeated and captured him. The person also sent a letter, naming and asking the Hawkins family to pay a ransom. Matthew thought it was too comical. How could a part-time pirate be robbed by a noble pirate? Jack's wife and children have all arrived, and William is the eldest in their family, relatively calm. He came to ask Andrew for help. Andrew. £1,000. How could that be so much? We're not nobles. Andrew emptied his pocket and sold some of his properties for £1,000, but is this a case of drinking from the West? This number may not seem big, but it requires comparison to know how much it is. As mentioned earlier, Henry VII left his son £2 million, which is equivalent to 15 years of England's fiscal revenue at this time. On average, it is only over £130,000 per year. It is recorded that a certain earl's net worth, including various real estate in the estate castle, was only over £8,000. It is recorded that the cost of the 900-ton Mary and John, a naval ship of Henry VIII, was £2,667, with an average cost of £2.96 per ton. Andrew couldn't read, so Matthew took the letter and carefully read it. Danny also leaned over to see this rare thing. Matthew. William, don't panic yet. Tell me, how many of them are there? Where are they now? William said, 4 people are waiting for an answer at my house. Matthew shouted, Robert. Robert, bring your weapon and let's go take a look. Danny. I'll go too. William's eyes rolled and he said, is there any problem? Matthew. It's just a guess. But it's best to have your knife ready. The English people of this era carry swords and are full of martial arts. A knife is not only a self-defense weapon, but also a tool for eating. Literal meaning. As for the fork, please, wait a few more decades. Everyone rode horses, and some strong individuals voluntarily followed. Jack's land is close to Plymouth. When Matthew saw it, several people who came to demand ransom were already surrounded. Wow, most of the people in this circle have the surname Hawkins. Matthew separated the crowd and said, I have a few questions, who can answer me? The 4 of them looked at each other and someone smiled, who are you? Matthew smiled and said, I am Matthew Hawkins, someone with the ability to pay a ransom. At this moment, the flashy Robert squeezed in, dressed up. The 4 of them couldn't laugh at once. We are also entrusted by others. This is to set ourselves apart. There are rumors in the martial arts world that mercenaries do not even accept demons because they are afraid. This outfit is not cheap, especially the 2-handed sword and genuine mercenary equipment. Even if it's a counterfeit, it's still a wealthy counterfeit. Matthew. Don't be nervous, I want to know if Jack Hawkins is safe and healthy. After all, he is a captain, how is his diet? Does he provide alcohol and meat? This was just a routine issue, and the 4 of them breathed a sigh of relief. He's very good, he can eat and sleep, and of course he has alcohol. I guess he's almost starving our client. Matthew. The second question is, are the sailors on the ship safe? How is their diet and whether they have alcohol? This is what many people present want to know, and they are also holding various strange weapons. It's normal to ask about alcohol. In this era, only alcohol is a safe water source when going out. A few people were injured or killed, but I don't know their names. The rest of them are fine. They can eat food, but we can't let them eat too much. As for alcohol, we don't have enough ourselves. So we don't have it. Very logical. Matthew looked around and saw a group of people full of murderous intent. Everyone relax, let go, let go. Matthew then turned around and said, the third question is, are those 2 boats and my wool intact? Asking about cargo is also a common question. Seeing a group of people putting down their belongings, the 4 finally relaxed. Someone replied, the ship is slightly damaged, and your wool is fine. As long as the ransom is in place, everything. Matthew chuckled lightly and said, you're here to scam ransom. Catch them for me. The sound is not loud, but incredibly clear. Everyone was stunned and immediately reacted. Robert's sword immediately swung towards one person. William let out a loud roar and grabbed the guy who was eating and rushed over. The reaction speed is not slow at all. Danny rushed over with everyone. For the 4 scammers, this is a dead end. The only source of vitality is Matthew. As long as you catch this wealthy young man who is completely clean, you should be able to turn the tables. The one who reacted the fastest immediately pulled out the knife and rushed towards Matthew. Unfortunately, this despicable boy only took 2 steps back and got mixed up in the crowd. In the next second, he was knocked down by a mess of grass forks and other things that had been stabbed in. End of this chapter. Chapter 9. Pirate's Nest. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 9 Pirate's Nest. Forgetting who it was, he said. Fraud is the main theme of human society. Whether it's men, women, old or young, landlords, merchants, illiterates or scholars, popes or kings. They are all deceiving each other for profit, without exception. Either in fraud, or on the path of fraud. Human beings are only divided into 3 types. Those who have not yet been defrauded, those who are currently defrauding, and those who have succeeded or failed in the scam. Matthew sneered. With shit in his heart, everyone is shit. The other person was dissatisfied and said, are you too young, or are you really ignorant of the inner world of humanity? Matthew. The reason why humans are great is because they constantly overcome their own weaknesses and restrain their own desires. Even a complex-minded hypocrite, if he disguises himself for a lifetime, does not harm others, and strives to maintain his image until death arrives, is he still a hypocrite? This person is not an infallible spirit. I never really thought about that. Matthew. If he takes this step, then he is a respected gentleman. There is a saying that goes, only by covering the coffin can we make a conclusion. The other person fell silent for a moment and said. It seems like you're right, but I'm not wrong either. But I do have a new understanding of this sentence. Matthew. Because there is never an absolute right or wrong. This person said, I want a pure world. Is there anything wrong? Matthew. There is never an absolute right or wrong. Matthew immediately stopped the angry crowd to prevent them from being chopped into meat sauce. Unfortunately, there is still an unlucky guy who has lost half of his head. Robert had a hint of resentment and said, why didn't you say it earlier? Let's hang them up first. Mr. Williams, everyone is precious. Don't tie your neck. Stupid, do you know what hanging up is? The 3 of them quickly became hanging salted fish, even their clothes were stripped off. Matthew walked under the tree, the snow creaking under his leather boots. Now, I have a few more questions, who can answer me? Due to the rope, 3 salted fish are slowly spinning. Someone begged for mercy, please, for the sake of God. God. Are you grateful to God or to me for letting you go? Matthew was a bit annoyed and said, who instructed you to come? The 3 of them suddenly lost their voices. There was a commotion among the onlookers, and William suddenly widened his eyes. Robert leaned on his big sword and looked left and right. Danny said, "Yes, they should still have accomplices." Matthew smiled and said, "Danny, it seems you have thought of it." Robert. "They are sailors. Or have been sailors before." Matthew observed carefully upon hearing the words, but his heart suddenly moved. People with complex thinking tend to have more thoughts. Matthew's first suspect was Jack Hawkins, who directed and starred. This is very common, even if modern police handle cases, the first suspect is the informant. The second suspect is the major families of Plymouth. Not many people know how much money the Hawkins family has. £1,000, which is quite accurate. After much thought, there are only two left. Jack Hawkins does have a motive. And his family just bought a boat, so there shouldn't be much gold coins left. Actually, Jack likes to carry gold coins with him. I only gave my wife and children a few for family use. Don't think this is a scumbag, there are not 100 men in this era who can give their wives gold coins. But Matthew cleared his suspicion in just 1 second. Matthew took out the letter and shook it. "Who wrote it for you?" A person said, "No one instructs us. You know, there are people in Plymouth who write letters for those who pay." Matthew chuckled lightly and said, "Don't lie to me, this is not good for you. There are only 116 people in Plymouth who can write, which one are you talking about?" The three of them suddenly became numb. "The people around me are also foolish." Surprisingly, Master Matthew even knows this kind of thing so well. No wonder their family can make a fortune. William took someone's axe from the crowd and said, "A person who is hanging and lying should cut off one hand." Everyone immediately agreed. Since it was to deceive the ransom, Captain Jack was certainly fine. It was likely that something had delayed, which was also common. So watching the excitement doesn't make things too big. William's face is already longer when pulled. His personality is similar to that of his father, and when he comes over, he will chop. The dried fish was immediately scared out of his wits and shouted, I said, it was a monk who found us. God, help me quickly." Danny smiled and said, "William, he wants to see God." Matthew raised his forehead and said, "William, he has already said it." William gestured with an axe, "What does it matter? My father said that anyone who deceives the Hawkins must pay a price. I'll ask again when I've done it." Robert couldn't help but approach and whispered, "Matthew, is this true? 116 can write." Matthew raised his eyebrows and said, "Guess what? To put it simply, Jack's farm is actually a pirate's lair." The scam also targeted Jack, and this is William's home court. After Matthew flipped his mind, he didn't stop him anymore. During this period, the English were able to breed pirates with a very fierce temperament. No one felt that William was doing something wrong, and everyone praised him. Ignoring the screams over there, Matthew turned his gaze to the other two, salted fish. "Do you know which monastery he comes from?" The clue is still broken. Although these fools poured beans out of the bamboo tube and said a lot of useless information. But they didn't know the origin of the messenger, so they collected some gold coins and ran to cheat. The object of suspicion naturally became a monastery. But the vast majority of things in the world do not require evidence. At the command of his son, Andrew went to the monastery to donate some gold coins and met with some monks. It was quickly hinted at. What monastery cannot make ends meet? There is a lot of land, but there is more desolation. It's a pity. So, you must be devout. You see, the behavior patterns of the powerful class are completely different from those of ordinary people. Many times, the fate of ordinary people is just a byproduct of their actions. Before the emergence of Protestantism in England, monasteries occupied 1/5 of England's wealth and 1/3 of its land, which was astonishing. And to everyone, there is no mistake in writing, not believers, to levy a tax of 11. Then the tax burden will be proportionally paid to the Holy See. In fact, some people believe that the so-called medieval Europe was actually unified. Unify under the name of the Church, even the king needs to be appointed and dismissed by the Church. Some people say that the reason why Italy prospered in the Middle Ages is due to various reasons. It is not said that it was because Catholicism, after absorbing the blood of Europeans, led to the extravagance of religious figures in Italy, which led to Italy's abnormal prosperity. It is only with demand that distant trade becomes meaningful. Matthew's perception of Catholicism is even worse. However, he is still planning to rent some land belonging to the monastery, as expanding the number of sheep is already in his interest. Even in wasteland, grass can grow. This is called compromise. Because he has no choice but to take the monastery. Unable to eliminate, so seeking coexistence. Since they coexist, why bother to deaden the relationship? A person who still has to pay taxes to vampires has no ability to overturn these vampires. However, there is someone who has this ability, but he has not yet awakened, and may even be a devout believer at the moment. This person is certainly Henry VIII. Matthew naturally regarded this handsome king as his future pillar. No matter how he is now, he will overturn the church in the future. Since that's the case, just wait and see. How handsome was this king when he was young? It can be explained in 8 words. Recognized in Europe and written in history. In mid-December, the blacksmith shop produced cast iron shells. Matthew wasn't really interested, but he still gave the reward according to principles. The sample weighs only 3 kilograms, with a round iron ball that is very small. What impressed Matthew's big iron glasses was that the sales of cast iron shells were actually customized. That's right, at this time, the various calibers of the artillery were in a mess, and the wall thickness and charge of the artillery were also different. It was simply a confusing account, with no standards at all, and could only be customized. Young master, have you ever considered using cast iron to make cannons? Matthew, who was in chaos, gave him a surprised look. In any era, people are not lacking in ideas. Is the idea of small balls rushing around unique? It's actually an old trick. During the Internet explosion more than 20 years ago, it was common to maneuver and operate planetary space fortresses in space. But who remembers the first person to propose it? Maybe it was a creative idea from a science fiction writer over 100 years ago. But this is also Matthew's original intention. The blacksmith is already married and can be considered a member of his own family. Great, you go and do it. Very straightforward, to the point of making the blacksmith blink a bit. First, make 2 doors and try to produce samples by the end of January. The caliber can only be multiples of inches, and it can be installed on a 100-ton sailboat. You can handle the rest. The blacksmith agreed one by one. If successful, you can share 15% of the blacksmith's future profits. What do you think? The blacksmith was overjoyed. He had been envious of the operating mechanism of the distillery for a long time. This means he has also become Matthew Hawkins' most trusted group of people, as well as profit sharing. Matthew suddenly remembered, by the way, where's my sword? It's been almost a month now, hasn't it? The blacksmith suddenly felt embarrassed and stuttered, yesterday. I sold it. Matthew was confused and still trembled a bit. You sold it. That's a gift I'm planning to give to someone. I'll give you a gold coin to decorate. How much did it cost to sell? End of this chapter. Chapter 10. Opening Remuneration. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The source has no content or has errors.